So again, I want to welcome everyone to our session today. Very exciting to have people from here in the U.S., Canada, from around the world. And if you are an international attendee and you want more information after the webinar, please contact the person who invited you to the webinar. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the webinar. So again, welcome everyone. I would like to introduce both of your presenters to you today, and they will officially get us started. Our first presenter today is Corey Arms. She has a bachelor's degree in both general and special education and a master's degree in special education with certification in the areas of educational diagnostician and mid-management. She's been now with Scientific Learning for 16 years, and I've worked with her the entire time she's been here, so it's really exciting. And we do have people joining us on the group chat. All right, so welcome everyone. It's really exciting to have everybody here today. And then we have Lynn Gover, who is our Fast ForWord Home Representative. And she's been with Scientific Learning now for 5 years and has worked with over 800 families. Her background is in software sales, focusing on relationship building. She's a mom of 10 wonderful kids and 3 amazing grandchildren. So please help me welcome our first presenter, Corey Arms.
Thank you, Carrie. First of all, I'd like to give a warm welcome not only to our guests from the United States, but also to our neighbors in Canada and those joining us from around the world. We're really glad that all of you are here with us today. And I know that those from other countries are probably most interested in information about auditory processing. So let's jump right in and get started with a poll question. So we have 4 options as to what brings you to the webinar today. First of all, do you want to learn more information about auditory processing? The second one, are you looking for information as to whether your child might have auditory processing disorder? Or do you need tools and strategies to help address those processing delays in your child? Or if none of those quite fit, then go ahead and tell us in the QA box what your thoughts are. What brought you here to join us today? So I'll give you just a minute or so to do that, to get your responses in. You can do that now for us. And once you click one of the buttons, click that submit button, so it will all go in. Hopefully everybody's gotten a chance to jump in there or put their responses in the QA box. So let's see what we have. All right. So about a third of the people want new information about auditory processing. So hopefully we'll be able to give that to you. Then we have almost another third wanting information to find out more about their child and to see whether they may have those issues. And then just a little bit over a third want tools and strategies to address those processing delays. And then we have a few others maybe looking in, responding in the QA box. So we'll get back to those in a little bit in our discussion. But I want to go ahead and jump in and tell you what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, why do these students struggle with reading and learning? What's going on that's causing these issues? And what does research say about processing and its role in literacy? How does that impact what the kids are learning to read and to do? Also, we want to know, what can we do about it? That's always the bottom line. What can we do to help these students out and to make a difference for them? And then finally, Lynn's going to take over and tell you about Fast ForWord Home and give you some really great information on this specific program that can help your students or children. So, first of all, let's look at the clues. What helps us know, what kind of things are we looking for to determine whether a child or a young person, maybe in our classroom, has an auditory processing issue. Well, here are some pretty common things. Some of the obvious signs is that the child or student in school misunderstands a lot of what's said. So maybe you're talking at home at dinner, if you're a parent, and your child misunderstands a couple of things that are said and totally miscues what the family is talking about at dinner. Or maybe in a classroom, a teacher might be presenting information about something, and the student goes a totally different direction, completely misunderstands what is said, and so really isn't cued in to what is happening. So these are the children who ask for things to be repeated frequently. They might say, huh, or what a lot. They might give a slow or delayed response to the point that you may think they're not even going to respond at all. For example, I had a student years ago who would raise his hand to answer a question, which was great. I was thrilled that he was participating, but there was a problem. He was answering a question that I had asked 5 to 10 minutes prior to where we currently were in the discussion. It took him that long to process that question and formulate a response. So not only was he delayed in responding to that first question, he missed everything else that happened after that point because he was focused on that one item. So these children and young people also often are the ones who have difficulty with multi-step directions. Some of these kids can be passive. They get very quiet and withdrawn when others are talking and they don't seem to engage. But if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because if they can't keep on track with the discussion, they're not going to be the ones that jump in to participate. It makes it much more difficult for those students to really engage, especially in rapid-fire discussions. So in school, teachers often report similar things to parents. The student may have a blank stare and need questions repeated or statements repeated. They respond with a lot of "I don't know" kind of comments. These are the students who tune out a lot, and that's a key piece. Auditory information is difficult for them. It goes too quickly, it's too complex, and they have trouble perceiving and holding on to information. So when listening is hard, what do you naturally do? You tune out. So if any of you have taken a college course or maybe some kind of extended learning course that was a little bit over your head, you might know what I'm talking about. Teachers talking away, and you're kind of thinking, what is this? I don't understand. I wish the professor would slow down. And in that situation, you may just fade out and tune out and just think it's too hard. I just can't keep up with this. And that's what we see with auditory processing issues. Some of you also may see that your student has trouble with phonics, reading, spelling types of activities, and you may even have some students who act out. School is frustrating, they aren't good listeners, it's hard to pay attention, and they've discovered that if they cause just a little disruption in class, or a big disruption, then they don't have to try to listen anymore. So sometimes we see unexplained behavior problems from students who generally have been pretty compliant in school. Teachers often are especially attuned to language-based problems because they'll see the impact on other academic areas. They know that a child who can't follow what's going on in class or can't participate is going to have academic problems in other subjects, particularly in the elementary years when most classroom instruction depends on the teachers talking, on those spoken words. children with language problems tend to fall behind and not build the foundation they're going to need for later years in school. So for a child with language problems, math gets harder when you've got story problems. Science gets harder when you have to read an article from the library. Any subject gets harder when you're expected to do a presentation in class, because it's just a challenge to have to process that information and get up and talk about it. So let's do another quick poll question here. This is a good place for us to talk about what areas are you most concerned about with your child. Is it homework? Does it take too long? It's a struggle. It's a huge fight. It's just too hard. Or is it more about reading? Are they struggling with that fluency, comprehension, and decoding pieces? Do they have trouble with writing, organizing their ideas, putting their thoughts into words, and doing that properly with correct spelling? Or do they have trouble with math, those math facts, having those memorized, or maybe it's the story problems that they struggle with? And if it's a different one again, if none of these quite fit, go ahead and put that in the QA box, and then as soon as you respond, please click Submit so we can see exactly what's going on with a lot of these kids. I'm going to give you a little bit of time. Looks like some people are seeing a little bit of everything. Even some questions about adult auditory processing. So, of course, that still applies to a lot of these things as well. We're going to see a lot of commonality between students and adults. So I think we've had time for people to make a selection and click Submit. So it looks like the biggest area of focus is in the area of reading, and we're going to get into that and talk about exactly what's going on with students with auditory processing issues and reading, the impact that has. The next highest one, it looks like, is writing, which, those are tied in together, just different sides of the same coin, so to speak. Math word problems, remembering facts, those kinds of things, as well as getting homework done. Always a struggle with that homework. It's hard to do. So, in relation to reading, since that was the number one topic, why would language and reading problems co-occur with these auditory processing issues? Well, first thing we have to understand is that if a child, say, has a lot of colds when they're young, they're going to have fluid in their middle ear during the time that the brain is setting up for those speech sounds, when it's creating the maps for listening to speech sounds. So each of the sounds in the English language or in any language maps to the brain. So if I can't process those sounds clearly because of the fluid in my ears, then I'm not going to get a good, clear map for each of the phonemes or sounds of the language. This also happens when a child has a lot of ear infections in those first few years, because those clear speech signals are not getting into the brain effectively, and the sound isn't going through the ears very well, so we're not getting that good mapping again. Some issues run in families. Maybe you've had a family member or two who've had trouble learning language. They had trouble building listening skills, or maybe had trouble learning to decode when they were learning to read. So that can be a genetic influence. It could be a predisposition to have some difficulty with perceiving those speech sounds and tying the sounds to words and meaning for language and then later for reading. Sometimes children are just the fifth child in the family, and mom and dad work, and there just isn't a whole lot of time for them to talk to, read to, or work with that particular child or group of children. And that especially happens, I think, today with the economy and busy home lives and just so much going on. It's just difficult to find time to sit down and read or work individually with each child. And then there are other things that we probably don't even think about, unknown factors that might influence, such as a noisy environment. Maybe if you live near a factory or a lot of road noise or anything that would interfere with the development of the sound maps in the brain. All those kinds of things can have an impact. So the bottom line is that these children often have difficulty processing language sounds clearly and effectively from an early age. It may carry through all the way to adulthood, but it starts in those very early developmental stages. And that means that they're going to perceive sounds incorrectly in those early years, so they're going to practice them incorrectly, and that's going to build faulty sound patterns in the brain. And that's what we want to change. So let's think about those auditory processing issues and why that would lead to a language and reading problem. And so we're going to look at what the brain has to do to perceive or hear speech sounds. So this is a visual representation, a speech map or physical characteristics of speech sounds. So we have two speech sounds represented here, ba, as in B-A, and da with D-A. So that's what we're looking at with this example, and the image shows 4 bands of energy that indicate frequency, or 3 actually. So you've got one at the top of the graph, one mid-level, and then it looks like one, but it's actually 2 separate at the bottom of the frequency. So the information we use to distinguish the ba from the da is at that very first tiny part of that blue line on the left. So I've highlighted that with those yellow bars. So if you look at the bottom horizontal part of the graph, what you see is 3 numbers. You've got a 0, a 40, and then 250. These numbers are in milliseconds or thousandths of a second, so it's important to see that when we have a syllable like ba or da, it lasts for 250 milliseconds. That's really not very long. It's just a quarter of a second for one syllable. So look at where that syllable changes, and you'll see where that first part that helps us distinguish the 2 sounds is only 40 milliseconds long. That longer part from 40 to 250, that's the vowel sound, so that stays the same. What's different is that first part covered by the yellow bar, that's about a 1/12 of a second long. So we have to be able to hear or perceive those changes really quickly to distinguish speech sounds in the English language. And whether or not we can do that will determine our processing abilities. So now, why would auditory processing problems be associated with reading difficulties? Well, what I want you to look at here is the reading brain. So in that top upper left corner, you have the left hemisphere, or the language center, of a young reader. Reading is superimposed, if you will, on the language center of the brain. So you can see there's a little red butterfly-shaped spot in the corner of the brain that links the hearing part of the brain to the seeing part of the brain, and I've circled that with a yellow circle. That little butterfly area is where children are hearing the sound and making that letter-sound correspondence, or linking it to the letter that they see. So if they see a letter A, they may think ah, or a, or the various other sounds that are associated with the letter A. If they see an O, they may think O, or they may think ah. If they see a letter B, they might be thinking B. They might be able even to sound out a word by going k, a, t, and thinking if you put it all together, it makes cat, because they can link the sounds to the letters and sound them out quickly and effectively. At this point, they aren't really comprehending much. They aren't reading for meaning yet because they're decoding. And that's what that little butterfly area shows us. It's a very important area when we're learning to read. But then if you look to the right side, you see the brain of adult readers. Adults don't have to decode as much. We don't have to sound words out unless it's a new word we haven't seen before. We can pretty much go from sound to meaning, and you can see that all that activity then moves to the frontal lobe of the brain. That frontal part is where all that red area is activated and where we learn how to read to learn. Using what we read to think about new things, using what we read to follow directions so we can put a new item together, maybe so we can read catalogs, we can read novels. Whatever you're using reading in any way, whenever you're doing that, the frontal lobe is involved because you're making decisions about things and remembering and processing information as you read. So a child has to go from the ability to decode to the ability to actually use reading to learn. We say that a child goes from learning to read to reading to learn. And that's a very important process for them to make. But what I want you to see is that with that little butterfly area in that first picture, it's dependent on the integrity of the auditory processing system, because that's what we need to link the sounds and letters together. We have to be able to know clearly what those sounds are to be able to make the correct associations with the letters that we're going to use. So we have new research dealing with auditory processing from two different places. One is from the Speech and Language Hearing Association, whose research was just published from February of last year in the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research Journal. And they found that auditory processing deficits were found prior to school entry in children who later were diagnosed with dyslexia. So making that link between auditory processing and dyslexia, this is more research supporting that. And the authors here, who you can see in that bottom section, said that the results support the existence of a general auditory processing impairment in developmental dyslexia, which might be the cause of a phonological problem, at least in a large set of persons with dyslexia. So that's a connection that a lot of people are interested in, wanting to know more about dyslexia. And then we also have another researcher at Northwestern University, Nina Kraus, who did a study where she had a bathing cap with electrodes that picked up brain waves. So she put this bathing cap on 3- and 4-year-olds in order to tell whether the children were actually perceiving speech sounds or not, whether their brains were registering the sounds, whether they could perceive them accurately. So while they were wearing these bathing caps and playing with toys, she would pump sound into the room such as ba, 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 or perhaps da, da, da. The sound might be all by itself, or it might be in an environment with noise, because we've got to figure out, can they process with background noise going on? Because school classrooms can be noisy places. So if it had background noise, it might sound something like this. Ba, 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 ba. So what she found out is when those 3- and 4-year-olds had trouble perceiving speech sounds and noise, and she followed them for the next 3 years, those children later had phonological processing issues. They had trouble rhyming. They had trouble figuring out what the first letters of words were. And those children often go on to have reading problems, which might not necessarily be diagnosed as dyslexia, but it definitely was pointed out that they did have issues with reading. So now let's get to the point of your students, your children, because that's why some of you are here. How do you know if your child's brain needs boosting? How do you know if an intervention might be helpful? So let's go back to what we talked about earlier. Do you get a lot of, huh, what, those kind of responses all the time where they don't seem to be able to handle information that's coming at them through the auditory channel? That's a sign they could have an attention problem and or an auditory processing problem. Oftentimes, those two things go hand in hand. If they have trouble learning the alphabet, memorizing math facts, making those letter sound connections, remembering nursery rhymes, especially if they're presented orally. So if they hear something and they have trouble remembering it and they need visual help to help them, that could be an auditory working memory process problem that often goes along with auditory processing issues. And then finally, the big key for all of us, and people often ask, what question do I ask in an IEP meeting? This is it. Is the child having problems sounding out words? Are they having trouble with decoding? Or do they have a history of speech sound production errors? Often these are kids who still are making speech sound errors, mispronouncing words much later than other children. So if you see a child with one of these, any of these areas, or a combination, you could recommend that the child have a complete auditory processing battery done to determine if the child does have an auditory processing issue. So let's jump back into a poll question, because I need to know how many of you are coming on today's call because your students already have an IEP. So if your child does have an IEP, it's yes. If not, they haven't been tested for any of these issues, it would be no. Or perhaps if your child has had other testing done, or maybe they have a 504 plan or something like that, go ahead and click Other and then put that in the Q&A box, and I will look for that. So we see a lot of things with multiple items, multiple issues. And I do have a question. I apologize. There's a question about what is an IEP. I'm sorry, that's an American term. It's an individual educational plan. So any student that is in a speech program or in receiving any sort of special ed services, they have a plan designed just for them to help meet their specific needs, and that's called an IEP or an individual education plan.
Also, Corey, someone just piped in and said IEPs are also used in Canada.
Okay.
So thank you for that person. Yeah.
All right. Some are saying that they do have a huge problem getting children tested sometimes. I do understand that. So it looks like the majority of people do have students who are receiving some type of services already. Some do not, about a little over a fourth do not. And then we have some of the ones that are have the 504, or they've tried to get some type of services. We also have some parents with students on the autism spectrum. So that may be something where you're trying to figure out, okay, Does my child have auditory processing issues or attentional issues? So we might get into that a little bit more when we get into the Q&A section, and can address some of those specific questions. So going back to the slides, I'd like to talk a little bit about some strategies and modifications. Some of your students who do have IEPs or have a plan in whatever program they're in may have some modifications already in place. But these are just some good general things that teachers can do, especially if the students do not have a plan in place already, just to help those students have an advantage in dealing with both attentional issues and auditory processing issues. So first of all, distraction can often be a problem, so we've got to think about that. We've got to move the students so they're not sitting by a window or a door or someplace where there's a lot of traffic, because that's just a logical place for kids to get distracted. So seating at the front of the room is often helpful, closer perhaps to the teacher's desk, not in a punitive way, but simply to give them the advantage of having a little more direct eye contact. If the teacher's in the front of the room talking, they can move a little closer to the desk to help that student get redirected a little more easily. Also, another thing to think about is improving understanding with simple questions and directions, keywords, picture cues. Those kinds of things really help students focus in a little bit better. If it gets too much information, it's a lot harder to stay focused for them, just as it is with us. So they also may need more breaks, because I'll tell you, for these kids, paying attention and understanding instruction takes a lot of effort. It can be exhausting. And so we want to think about that for these students and help the teachers understand that simple things like that can make a big difference for these students. There's some other things that are helpful as well. Show the students how to do things. Rather than providing explanations, especially in-depth ones. Sometimes when children or young people are having difficulty understanding, we have a tendency to want to talk and explain more, and that just adds to the problem. So simple, simple, simple is always our best strategy. Again, special cues can help the student when they're off task. Maybe you have a little signal, or you have a little manipulative you hold up, or at home, you can have your own little signals. I've seen people pull on their ear, and that's a cue to the student that, are you listening? I had a student years ago who was very bright, but when I was talking to the kids, I can often see by his expression when he kind of left us mentally and went off on a rabbit trail during a lesson or discussion. So we just created a little code phrase that would trigger him to come back and pay attention and stay focused. And it took a little bit of effort, but he was able to do that. So again, giving them more time, eliminating background noise whenever possible, having the kids verbalize what they're learning. That's a big thing in helping them process the information. So, bottom line, the key is keeping things simple and quiet when possible. Check for understanding, give them more response time, and that gives them a chance to process both the question and what they want to say. Both are important. So now let's talk about what else you can do to make a difference for your students who are struggling in these areas. That's why we're all here, and that's what I want to share and what Lynn is going to share. So we know that auditory processing can be exercised and practiced through technology. If the technology includes exercises that are designed to build up that capacity to process those speech sounds, to perceive them clearly, so the child can develop the ability to process and perceive the sounds just as any other student would do. So let's go back just for a second to those quick components of sound that I talked about, that B and D. Technology can stretch out those sounds and double the length of time that transition occurs, that very rapid change that helps us distinguish the ba from the da. So with technology, we can stretch out that 40 milliseconds of time and have it to be 80 milliseconds and have it to be twice as loud. So it gives us twice the time and twice the volume, which makes speech sounds easier to perceive. And if the speech is easier to perceive, the brain can begin dealing with it and making a map for those sounds. Excuse me. This makes speech sounds more accessible to children who struggle with speech and also auditory processing. So let's look at the evidence for that technology and neuroscience technology specifically can make a difference. So just last year, there was research published that asked the question, is neuroscience research useful for educators? The authors concluded that after reviewing the research, that the answer was definitely yes, because when you use neuroscience-based approaches, you can see changes both in brain function and the behavior can change. The child now can perceive those speech sounds, but you can also actually see that the brain itself has been changed, that it's been augmented. So let's look at an example of that. This is research done by Elise Temple at Stanford University. She had typical readers there on the left whose brains you can see were reading well. They have areas of activation highlighted by those little circles that show that the brain is working in concert, that phonological area, the processing and memory areas, all the areas that are needed for good reading are working together in concert. There were 35 of those students, and what she did was ask them to do a rhyming task while they were in an fMRI scanner. So that's a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and what it does is look to see where blood flow is going to the brain, because those are the areas that are activated during different tasks. So that's what's happening in the left. On the right, we see another 35 children who were about 7 years old and who were diagnosed with dyslexia. You can see that when they were asked to do a rhyming task, even though they could rhyme, those same areas of the brain, in the frontal lobe and that temporal parietal region, those areas did not light up in the language and reading parts of the brain. They simply were not activated properly. But after just 6 weeks on a neuroscience-based intervention that uses that stretched speech to build auditory processing, we can see those areas now are lighting up. Researchers saw a change in function and at the same time went back and tested those students' ability to read, which Elise Temple actually did twice at Stanford, and Nadine Gaub also did at Harvard a few years later. They saw behavioral changes in reading as well as those functional changes in the brain. And the product that provided that stretched speech and was used in these studies is a neuroscience-based program called Fast ForWord. So in addition to research studies, and there are many, many more available on the Scientific Learning website, we have testimonials from parents and educators. It's always good to hear from educators and parents directly about what they think and to know that changes aren't just happening in scientific articles, but also in real-life settings. So here are some examples of postings from our Facebook page that different parents have made. And those postings are unsolicited. The parents just put these comments up, and you can see that they're talking about the progress and the great results they've seen in their children, often talking specifically about auditory processing issues that have been resolved after students completed the Fast ForWord products, or one of those products or more. So we have some that are talking about a child with auditory processing who now is graduating from college, amazing results, best thing we've done, those kinds of things. So 96% of the parents surveyed have reported improvement in language, reading, general schoolwork, and their cognitive skills, which are things like their memory, their attention, their processing of information, and their ability to sequence things or put them in order just from using the Fast ForWord product. So now I'd like to transition and let Lynn tell you more about her story and about the Fast ForWord Home program. Lynn?
Thank you so much, Corey. I do appreciate all of the time that you've spent with our families today talking about auditory processing. And I love this testimonial page. I actually had a conversation with a mom this week, and this is a mom of a 7-year-old little boy who has auditory processing challenges, and they've been doing the Fast ForWord program now for 14 weeks, so they're almost done with their subscription. And the things that she's told us that she's seen improvements on are really almost a checklist to one of your earlier slides. So one of the big areas that she said they saw improvements on were better classroom participation. He actually has started to get awards now for having good behavior in the classroom, less tuning out, right, less causing small disruptions so he doesn't have to pay attention. She's also talked about the fact that now he readily raises his hand in the classroom. He wants to participate. He no longer has that deer in the headlights look when the teacher calls on him. He's able to keep up with what the teacher is presenting in the classroom. She also said he's spending less time on his iPad, and he's actually wanting to read books. He's actively going to get books and spending time with books and putting the iPad aside. And because of his auditory processing challenges, he really didn't have a lot of friends in his social circle, maybe one child at a time. And she noticed on the playground that he was actually in a group of 3 other children, and he was able to engage in conversation with all 3 of them and not look left out. And she said prior to that, he always looked sad and left out on the playground. And she's noticed that that social ability has changed for him in just this 14-week time period. So these testimonials that we get that are, obviously unsolicited are also things that we, Fast ForWord sales representatives, hear all the time from our families. We always hear the improvements that these children are making. So not just giant academic improvements, but all these little things, right, that kids need to do well to be able to participate in the classroom, to have less frustration, to have better social interactions and better behavior. We hear these types of improvements from our parents all the time. So thank you, Corey, for introducing that testimonial page. Fast ForWord is a program that you use at home. It helps to remediate the language and reading skills in a very fun and engaging way. It's a service that will provide you with the program itself, but also your own one-on-one educational consultant who's there to support you and your child while they go through the program. One of the things that we talk about with our families and the Fast ForWord program is there will be times while they're on the program that they might have some frustrations or might experience a plateau of them achieving the skills. And that's what that consultant is there to do. They're there to help you get through this program in the most effective and efficient manner. When we talk about reading problems and we talk about kids who have IEPs or have extended time to do certain tasks in the classroom, we view those other things as Band-Aids, right? And what we talk about Fast ForWord is no more Band-Aids on these reading problems. It's the combination of this neuroscience technology and education right? The ability for the child to absorb all that's going on in the classroom in the most efficient way possible. We are going to the root causes. We're targeting these missing skills and these weaknesses that other programs and other methods don't address. I talk to parents all the time who tell me, we've been tutoring them in reading for years, and yet we really don't see any gain. We're still multiple years behind. And they'll talk about, well, we do more reading every night. We're reading 30 to 40 minutes every night, and yet we don't see this translating to gains in the classroom. And that's because that's not getting to the cognitive areas of the brain that need to be remediated so that these other activities that you're doing can be that much more impactful. The program itself, this is the biggest differentiating feature to me, is that it's individualized. Really, every click of the mouse your child makes, the algorithms in the background are changing and modifying for your child's abilities. It's giving them more exposure, right, to those type of exercises that our program identifies they need more help with. And this is an 80-20 rule. 80% of the time, we have to set those little brains up for success, right? Because that's what releases those positive chemicals. That's how we start to create those amazing pathways. But 20% of the time, we do have to challenge them. And again, that's where your consultant will come in and help with those areas that could be challenging for your child. The program itself has to be intense, right? That's how we make those changes in the brain. It's not over long periods of time. It's over a shorter time period. That's giving them 5 times more practice on these cognitive and reading skills, more than any other intervention or approach out there. And the results that you'll get from the program are continuous, right? We say once the brain is wired for reading, it stays wired. These are lifelong results. And we have tons of research and longitudinal studies that show, and the brain mapping of these children, once they've done the program, the brain will use those new pathways, right, and use them very effectively and very efficiently. And the more it uses them, boy, the better and better they become. And one of the things that we've done, too, is we've introduced this on an iPad. We know that this generation of kids, they are really great with technology, so it is available on the iPad. And we know that that makes a big difference, really, with the younger kids. They do stay focused for longer periods of time when using the iPad. So I talked earlier and spoke about our educational consultants. So when you're using the Fast ForWord program at home, there are a couple things that we want you to follow. One is our research protocol, which is 30 minutes per day, 5 days a week for a 4-month time period. And 30 minutes is the minimum. You can do more. The more exposure you give your brain to these types of exercises, the more experience it has in those areas, the quicker those areas will start to remediate. Your assigned consultant is going to work side by side with you. You will have that same person the entire time you are using the program. They will be providing you with weekly reports, and you'll have regularly scheduled phone calls to talk about your child's progress. And we work with you to make sure that these results come quickly, right, and that your child's improvement continues. We are constantly monitoring where they are and how they are going through the program. This is what your child would be experiencing. You know, a lot of people say, what does Fast ForWord look like? Well, Fast ForWord for elementary students will look like the images that you see on the left-hand side. So everything is character-driven, which is what keeps children engaged. And then when we move on to the middle through high school series, you'll see those characters change, right? We do want to make them more age-appealing to older students, which is a key component, right, in keeping kids involved in the program itself. And again, there are some additional videos that you can look at online. I know we have some things on the Fast ForWord homepage that will kind of allow you to look at these a little bit more in depth. Here's a good question that, you know, this is a conversation I have with my families all the time. Is your child currently receiving any extra help for his or her areas of weakness? Are they getting tutoring? Do they have an IEP? Do they have a 504? What other things have you tried, right? What other things have been successful? What other things haven't worked for you? So are they receiving extra help at this time for the areas that you feel they struggle with? So if you want to go ahead and answer that. And if you have other things, right, please, you know, as Corey instructed earlier, you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A box. And wow, a large percentage of your children are currently receiving extra help for their area of weakness. So they are getting some extra things in the classroom, maybe some extra tutoring outside of the classroom, maybe things that you're doing as parents at home. Maybe you've got some additional programs that you've been using, but obviously you're doing a lot of things, right, to try to help get these areas remediated for your child. So as a parent, when you think about what you're doing, what you could be doing, it's always kind of the big question is, what's the next best step to take with your child? Because there are so many options. And all times things out there can sound very similar. You'll say, well, we're doing this reading program, or we heard about this program. And we just want you to know that we have talked with hundreds of parents, and we are more than happy to just talk with you to help you determine if Fast Forward is a good fit for you and for your family. We want to make sure that this is the right program. And whatever you decide, as a family, we encourage you to keep seeking out new information, but we really are confident that you probably won't find a better program than Fast Forward. So again, these are questions you could ask yourself, when is a good time to start? Is it now? How long does it take to get started? What are the next steps? And your Fast Forward representative would be more than happy to answer any of these questions for you. I want to introduce my Fast Forward Home team. I do manage a great group of professionals that have been with the company, quite a while. So if for any of you that are maybe currently receiving emails or you've been in conversations, I would like to introduce via pictures and a little quote from each of my team members. You've got Cindy Kupfer, who's been with Fast Forward now for 7 years. You've got David Dixon, who's also been with Fast Forward for 7 years. Myself, I've been with the company 5 years, and Laura Higgins has been with the company now for 3 years. So we have people who are dedicated to answering the questions that you have about your child and making sure that this program is going to be the right fit. I really do want to thank everyone for joining us today. You will get an email from your Fast Forward Home representative with a link to the webinar. Please, feel free, share this with your spouse. Share this with other people who are part of your child's educational circle of learning. Get input from other people. As a parent myself, I always looked to my friends, to find out things that they did, right, that helped improve their child's academic struggles. So share this with your friends if you know that their children are struggling as well. You will get a PDF of all the slides. Please do visit our Fast Forward homepage. We have a lot of resources there. We've got great videos. We have all of our scientific research. We have parent testimonials. We do put any type of offers that we're having on that Fast Forward homepage as well. But it's just a really great place that you can go and get additional information. I think what we're going to do now is actually open this up to Q&A. So, Carrie, I'm going to go ahead and hand this back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, both to Corey and to Lynn. And I'll start with the questions I got kind of throughout the webinar today. And the first question that came in, this is for Corey. This person is wondering, she's saying, out of curiosity, many of these problems naturally exist with kids on the spectrum. So how do you separate auditory processing from autism? Any ideas on that?
Well, that is a challenge because a lot of times these, attention issues, processing issues are represented in a variety of different disabilities or conditions. So it is hard sometimes to tell them apart. I think maybe a visit to an audiologist who could perhaps do more in-depth testing than perhaps the school could even do would be an option. The great thing, though, is if your child has autism, can wear a headset and tolerate the headset, then you could go ahead and use Fast Forward, because whatever the cause, it should address it. It doesn't matter what the initial cause is. It's going to work on the issue itself. So I think that would be a big help. But going through your school district, if they have some good testing options for you to try to narrow this down, or going to an audiologist. Some areas have clinics that specialize in autism. They might be able to give you some more information as well. But it is a challenge because a lot of things, issues such as attention and processing, are represented in a variety of issues.
Okay, so the next question that came in is, what does an auditory processing battery consist of? Any idea on that one?
Well, they do. One of the things is kind of like we talked about, can they make that letter-sound correspondence? So, for example, there's a test called Lindemuth Auditory Conceptualization Test, and they have little blocks, so they'll have like 3 little different colored blocks, and the speech pathologist might say, this is k, this is a, and this is t, pointing to the 3 different blocks. Make it say tack, or where they have to manipulate the blocks just as if they were changing the word bat from bat to tab. So manipulating the blocks just as they would letters in words, but they aren't using the letters. It's helping them process the sounds. So you get an idea of, do they understand that manipulation? Can they distinguish those sounds? So there's different assessments like that where they can pinpoint whether the child truly is processing the sounds clearly and effectively and can manipulate those sounds. So it's different assessments like that. It's typically done in a school district. It would be done with a speech pathologist in most cases. But again, you could also go to an audiologist as well. But you do have to find an audiologist that specializes in auditory processing issues.
Okay. And then I think that would dovetail into this question about how can I find out if my daughter is on the spectrum?
Well, again, it's going to depend on the school district. So, for example, the school district I was in had a team that would do a multidisciplinary team. So it was a diagnostician, a speech pathologist, a school psychologist, a school counselor in some cases, would come and observe the child, do some different assessments, and make those kinds of determinations. You also sometimes will have a local facility that can help with that. It may be some kind of a child study center, or sometimes if you're in a university town, they may have some resources if they have an education department. Or you also could even go to your pediatrician or physician and find out what resources are available in your area specifically.
Okay, so next question. We have several, so I'd like to get through a few more before we finish today. My daughter is a healthy 7th grader. She does well in school, but she just doesn't like to read. I think she's a slow reader and gets confused when she's reading. She's overwhelmed by thick books and books with a lot of words in them, narrow spacing, would rather watch videos. What can we do to get her interested in reading and comprehending what she's reading?
Well, there's really 2 different kinds of processing in play. We've got the processing of the individual sounds of language, being able to tell that B sound from the D sound. But you've also got processing of what I call chunks of information, or macro processing, where I have to read a chapter and be able to come back tomorrow and talk about it, or read a book and understand and follow the story, those kinds of things. So it could be that your daughter has the capability of decoding, dealing with that letter-sound correspondence, but then it just gets to be too overwhelming. It's too much information. She doesn't understand what she's reading very well, those kinds of things. So again, Fast ForWord which is available at home, as Lynn talked about, but schools often have it as well, that can help with that that phoneme processing, as well as the big chunk processing of macro processing. So it really helps them be able to assimilate that information, and just reading begins to make more sense, is more enjoyable. I had lots of kids whose parents told me they went from the student couldn't stand to pick up a book to they read everything they saw. And so that's what we want our kids to do right there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Let's see here. Does it matter how old the child is when they start the program, and will it affect their progress? So age and maturity and all that, does that make a difference?
You know, the great thing that I've found with Fast Forward, and I think our research holds it up, is that it works at any age. You know, of course, ideally we would want to get to the younger children and address the issue early on, but we've had high schoolers use Fast Forward and made phenomenal gains, because it's like all those pieces kind of all of a sudden fit together and made sense, and school and schoolwork was just not so hard anymore. And so we often see really big gains in older students, which makes sense because they've got the biggest gaps in most cases. So any age, I would recommend any age getting on it. I'll tell you, I went through as an adult. I didn't have an auditory processing issue, but auditory memory was not my strong point. I remembered things I saw, but not what I heard so much. And it made a big difference for me in a very short time. So I would say, yes, even if auditory processing is not the issue, the primary issue, that there's a lot of things that Fast Forward helps with: memory, attention, different kinds of processing, sequencing, as well as just general reading and understanding and building that enjoyment of doing it and feeling success, often for the first time.
Okay, we're going to take a few more questions if you and Lynn can go over the hour here. If that's okay.
Yeah, sure, that's
we
fine.
have a person writing asking, their son is 23 with autism. He learned to read by himself before the age of 4, but we aren't sure how much he understands. Do you think Fast Forward could work for him? Just on a side note, before you answer that, our blog post this week, located at www.signlearn.com/blog, has a real-life story about how Fast Forward made a difference with their child with autism. So, Corey, jump on in here.
Okay. Yes, it very well could help him. Let me give you an example. I had a student with autism the first summer that I ran Fast Forward. He could read, but his parents were kind of in the same situation. They didn't know if it was just word calling or if there was really good understanding going on. And he went through the program, and we saw some significant changes in his test scores. For example, that Linda Mood auditory conceptualization test I mentioned, where they're manipulating sounds, his score went from a 33 to a 66 in less than 2 months. So that's a big jump. That's a huge change in understanding. And I got a note from his mom after we finished the program, and because we did a summer school session, and she said, you know, he didn't talk until he was 4.5 years old. And at that point, we didn't know if he ever would talk. She said, now after Fast Forward, we're not sure he'll shut up. And then she said, that's okay, because it's music to our ears. And he began to be more expressive. He began to give more affective type statements. So things like, it makes me angry when you do that, Mom. Things that he had never said before, he started doing after Fast Forward. So that can make a big difference in general socialization and functioning.
Okay, so the next question is, will this help both executive function and cognitive ability? My son has been diagnosed with ADHD, APD, ASD mild, along with multiple learning disabilities.
Yes.
Did you get that?
Okay. I did. Yes, I got it.
Okay.
Yes, it's hard when they have multiple issues. I certainly understand that. But again, I would say give it a try because Fast Forward works on those cognitive skills. It's not just language, it's not just reading. It's working on the foundational learning issues, so processing, paying attention, being able to do all those kinds of things, including the executive function. Can he sit still? Can he pay attention? Can he maintain focus and respond appropriately? I would have to say yes. I'm not going to promise you that it's going to magically cure everything immediately. And I would say don't believe anybody who tells you they have something that can. But it's going to make a difference. And if you the key, I'll tell you the key, as it is with anything, use it correctly, use it consistently, and make sure they understand what they're doing and they're doing it correctly. And we have lots of helps. That's what Lynn's team is there for. And that will help make it work the best for your child, the quickest and the most effectively.
We got, before we end, this is more for Lynn, we did get pricing questions. How much does it cost? I will make a disclaimer before Lynn answers. If you are outside the U.S. and Canada, please, you can actually contact me directly, and I can get you in touch with our international partners. You can email me at webinars@scilearn.com, but Lynn can address the question from a U.S.-Canada perspective. So, Lynn.
Thank you, Carrie. So the price for the Fast Forward Home program is inclusive of a 4-month block of time for your child to use the program. That includes any levels that they can complete in that 4-month time period, and it also includes you working one-on-one with your own consultant. It's a one-time fee of $1,500, that's $1,500 US dollars, to participate in the program for that 4-month block of time.
Beautiful. So thank you so much for that, for answering that question. We got a few people asking that one. We'll do one more question if you guys are up for it. The last question is, how do you track and report progress on improvement? How do they know they're making progress if they go through the program?
Lynn, do you want to take
you want that to be for me? I'll take part of that.
Okay, let's share.
Okay, so you will receive weekly reports, and these reports will tell you every step of the way how your child is doing on the particular exercises in the Fast Forward program. So exercises, for instance, that would be focusing on auditory processing. You will see where they start, how they go through, where they make advances. You'll even see where they struggle. I mean, and that's part of the program itself, is it will identify areas that they're struggling with. These will be ongoing conversations also that you have with your educational consultant, talking about how your child's doing while they're on the program. For a lot of our parents, they've got the spring testing, or they have the most recent reading results, right? So we'll start with that. We like parent input. We'll take the information that you have, and as your child goes through the program, they'll have opportunities in school to be retested, right, or have new state scores and things like that. And you can then see for yourself where they've progressed to. The reports that you get from us on a weekly basis are really about the child going through the program, but we do provide our parents with a checklist, and we encourage them to give it to the teachers as well, so that they can see where they're seeing gains. And, I want to say this for a lot of our families, it's not just academic gains, right? We're not just looking for them to be better readers. We're looking for them to have better social interactions, to have more self-confidence. So those things are something you won't see on a report, right? You as a parent, you'll see that with your child as you sit beside them while they go through the program. Or like the parent I spoke with this week, as you watch them on the classroom or on the playground, engaging in a much better way. So that's, kind of the things that we look for, and we give feedback to our parents. But we look for feedback from you guys as well. We want to know what you're seeing in the day-to-day changes in your child. And Corey, do you have anything you want to add to that as well?
Well, the only thing I would add is that if you're in a school and using it from a school district perspective, there are tons of reports that you get as educators to help you know exactly how the students are progressing, what kind of mistakes they're making, ideas for ways to help you intervene and support the students as they're going through the exercises. And there's even a report that can be sent home to parents from the school that helps, or emailed, that helps the parents know how well the students are progressing as well. So lots and lots of supports built in for both parents that Lynn's team works with, as well as educators using the products as well. And, of course, for those across the world, we have our VARS team that provides support as well.
So a couple of logistical questions for Lynn and Corey before we end, another 2 minutes before we get to the end of our webinar. Is the summer program, if you were to use this for summer, we're coming up on summer vacation, an ideal time to be running Fast Forward. Is there a shorter version of the 4-month program for summer school, or how would that work? And then the other question is, do we have a payment schedule that allows people to pay over a series of months? So those are the last questions of the webinar.
Sure. So I'll do the alternate to the 4-month subscription. Yes, over the summer we do run what we call a 2-month intensive Fast Forward program. So on a typical 4-month subscription, kids are logging on, 5 days a week, a minimum of 30 minutes a day. When we truncate that, right, and we make it be a 2-month subscription, we're looking for a lot more participation, 60 minutes a day, so up to 90 minutes a day. So yes, we do offer the summer program. It is a shorter duration, but it is more intense. And we do have a payment schedule. You can do 3 payments of $500 to cover your 4-month subscription cost.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both for staying on a little bit longer for the webinar. I really, really appreciate that. I think we answered everyone's questions, I think. If we didn't get to your question, please email me at webinars@scilearn.com. But excellent. We got a lot of questions during this webinar. Thank you so much to Corey and Lynn for their time today. Thank you, our attendees, for joining us. And again, in about an hour or two, you can actually click back on the link, your Join Now link, and your confirmation email will send you right back to here. If you want to view this again, we'll try to get this out by end of day tomorrow. And thank you so much for joining us. This concludes our webinar for today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening or afternoon, wherever you are.
Bye.